All right, today we're diving into one of the most, well, dynamic periods in all of American history, the decades right before the Civil War. It's known as the antebellum era, and it was a time when this incredible wave of reform movements just swept across the country, all driven by this really ambitious, you might even say audacious goal of creating a perfect society.
This quote from the reformer Margaret Fuller, it just says it all, doesn't it? It's so passionate, it's demanding, and it's totally rooted in this deep belief that a better, more just world wasn't just some pipe dream, it was a moral necessity. And that's the energy, that's the fire that we're going to see fueling all these crusades we're about to explore.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big ideas that sparked this whole thing. Then, we'll see how it played out, first with reforms aimed at individuals, then at society's core institutions, and then the big one, the fight for basic human rights. And finally, we'll ask what happened to this revolutionary spirit. Okay, so the big question right off the bat is why? Why then? What was in the water that made so many Americans look around and think, you know what, we can and we should remake this entire country from the ground up? Well, it was really a kind of perfect storm of ideas. You had that old school Puritan sense of having a divine mission, right? And you mix that with the Enlightenment's really optimistic belief in human reason and basic goodness. Then you throw in the raw democratic energy of the Jacksonian era. And the real kicker? The Second Great Awakening. This massive religious revival convinced millions of people that they could get rid of sin, not just in their own hearts, but in all of society. So with all this incredible energy, this impulse first turned inward. Reformers started by focusing on changing individual behavior, and their number one target, by a long shot, was what they called demon drink. So why all the fuss about alcohol? Well, get this. In 1820, the average American drank 5 gallons of hard liquor a year. That is a truly astonishing number, and reformers saw a direct line from that statistic to crime, poverty, and domestic abuse. To them, this wasn't just a personal choice, it was a full-blown national crisis. What's so fascinating here is seeing how the temperance movement grew up. It started out with simple moral persuasion, asking people to sign a pledge saying they'd stop drinking. But then you see a shift. Groups like the Washingtonians started to frame alcoholism as a disease that needed treatment, kind of like an early Alcoholics Anonymous. And when that wasn't enough, the movement went political, eventually leading to Maine becoming the very first state to ban the sale of alcohol completely. But this drive for reform didn't stop at the individual. Oh no, it expanded to an even more ambitious goal, rebuilding the very institutions that held American life together. Everything from mental asylums and prisons to the schools that were shaping the next generation. The story of mental health reform in America is pretty much the story of one person, Dorothea Dix. She was a school teacher, and one day she visited a jail and was just completely horrified by what she found. People with mental illnesses were locked up, sometimes chained, in these disgusting, unheated cells right next to violent criminals. And Dix didn't just get upset. She got to work. She launched this relentless, years-long crusade, documenting these awful conditions and taking her findings to one state legislature after another. Her work single-handedly led to the creation of America's first generation of professional mental hospitals. It's just an incredible testament to the impact one determined person can have. You see that same impulse changing prisons. The idea wasn't just to punish anymore, it was to rehabilitate. 2 different models popped up. You had the Pennsylvania system, which used complete solitary confinement to try and force repentance, though sadly it led to a lot of suicides. And then you had the Auburn system in New York, which mixed strict discipline with work and moral classes. But the key thing is, both of them were built on this belief that a structured environment could literally reshape a person's character. Meanwhile, another major reformer, Horace Mann, was taking on education. He looked at the growing number of uneducated kids, especially in the cities, and saw a real danger to the country. And his solution was radical for the time, the common school. This was the idea that every single child, no matter their family's wealth, deserved a free education paid for by taxes. And the goals here were huge. Make school mandatory for all kids, have a longer school year, and actually train teachers to be better at their jobs. But listen, it wasn't just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. A huge part of this was moral education. Using these incredibly popular textbooks called McGuffey Readers, schools were designed to teach the virtues of a good industrial worker. Be hardworking, be on time, and don't drink. But for all the ambition we've seen so far, these movements almost pale in comparison to the two most radical, most explosive crusades of the entire era: the fight to destroy the institution of slavery and the struggle to win basic rights for women. Now, it's super important to realize that the anti-slavery movement wasn't just one big happy family. It was full of different, often competing groups. You had the American Colonization Society, whose idea was to send free Black people to a colony in Africa. Then you had the hardcore radicals like William Lloyd Garrison. He demanded immediate freedom for all enslaved people with no compensation for the owners, and he famously burned a copy of the Constitution, calling it a pro-slavery document. And then you had the more pragmatic Liberty Party, which tried to end slavery by working through the political system. But without a doubt, the most powerful and compelling voices in the entire abolitionist movement belonged to people who had escaped slavery themselves. People like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. They could speak with an undeniable moral authority that no one else could. Their firsthand stories of the sheer brutality of slavery did more to change minds in the North than any philosophical argument ever could. And it was right from inside the abolitionist movement that the organized women's rights movement was born. It's an incredible story. Activists like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to London for a World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. But when they got there, they were told they weren't allowed to speak on the floor because they were women. That shared moment of humiliation was the spark. It lit a fire, and 8 years later, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention. And what they did there was absolutely revolutionary. They issued a document they called the Declaration of Sentiments, and they took the most famous, most sacred words in American history, and they changed them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Just by adding 2 words, they laid claim to the nation's founding promise and kicked off the formal, organized struggle for equality that, of course, continues to this day. So this whole era was just buzzing with this incredible energy, and, real progress was being made. But as the 1840s turned into the 1850s, all these different streams of reform started getting pulled into the vortex of one single, massive gathering storm. And that's the thing. Ultimately, the national crisis over slavery just became so huge, so intense, that it basically swallowed everything else. The debates about schools and prisons and alcohol didn't vanish, but they were definitely pushed to the side as the nation just marched, step by step, toward the Civil War. Which kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. These reformers, with all their flaws, they truly believed they could create a more perfect society. They fought for ideals that were left unfinished. It really makes you wonder, right? How do the modern struggles for justice and equality connect back to the seeds that were planted in this wild, remarkable age of reform?